Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Can I just check with Russ at Cloud Hill? We're everybody in and we're good to go. Oh, you're on mute. That classic. Yep, got a thumbs up. That's brilliant. Okay, everybody, I'll kick off in the interest of time. So welcome to the next in this year's series of RLC Foundation seminars, which today has been very kindly sponsored by one of our members, Wilson James, who I'd like to thank very much for their support in doing so. It really helps in this online era with that kind of support. So thank you very much for doing that. Obviously, we've had a series of seminars and tried to tackle the macro issues, technology, leadership, and people. And today's panel really is turning its eyes to the future. So, advertised as the integrated review, but realistically what we're trying to get towards is a really good discussion on the future of military logistics in the context of that new policy, where it sort of more than ever relies on a coherent approach between, regular reserve, civilian and industry, from the strategic base right the way through to the farthest elements of our global reach. Now, that's obviously been put forward in policy context as part of the government's integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, to give its full title, namely Global Britain in a Competitive Age, which came out in March this year, followed very closely in the same month by the Defence Command Paper, and in parallel, the Defence and Security Industry Strategy. Three sort of really key documents now, where I think kind of overarchingly, the integrated review clearly lays out the government's vision for the UK to 2030. It provides a strategic threat assessment. It identifies the UK's foreign policy priorities for the next 10 years, at least. And in parallel or subject to that, the Defence Command Paper focuses on the defence aspects and outlines the plan to modernise the armed forces. Quite widely described, I could quote a number of people, but quoted in Parliament as the most radical assessment of the UK's place in the world since the end of the Cold War. Now, I'm going to leave it to our speakers to bring that to life, but I think realistically, we all are students of this, and the challenges are significant. And I'm not really going to try and break into each one of them, but it is entirely clear managing the rise of an assertive China, checking Putin's Russia, halting Iranian malign influence and nuclear ambition, suppressing radical Islamist terrorism, countering bioterrorism and cyber extortion, managing a global pandemic and tackling global warming. That's a fairly monumental number of tasks in front of us, and all, of course, within the context of an era of the most rapid technological advancement, frankly, in human history. Which is why I think the emphasis for the armed forces in the IR is to underwrite that strategic concept of global Britain, based on, and I quote, a dynamic international footprint supporting a global network of partners and allies, a modernized force structure with a richer blend of regular and reserves fit for the digital age and adapted to the changing character of warfare, supported by the capabilities, the culture and the skills for what actually lies ahead of us rather than already behind us. And I think most critically for this community of interest, the notion of strategic resilience and the integrity of our strategic base has risen significantly up the agenda. And I think, obviously, our focus is on army logistics, military logistics. And for the army, CGS has said that, and again, quoting here, soldiering has always been about evolution, and successful armies have always adapted to the changing nature of the threat and to changes in technology. And it feels to him, CGS, that we sit today on the cusp of another transformation where, quote, there is no room for nostalgia. So there is a good question right there, I suspect. In fact, he's described that transformation proposition as the most radical change since the 1930s. effectively from mechanization in the 30s, out with the horse, in with the combustion engine, to digitization in the 21st century across the traditional domains of land, sea, and air, but now also, of course, space and cyber, integrating effects across domains and fundamentally changing the way we do our business, moving from the industrial age to the information age. So the key aim of the transformation, appears to me, is to harness the conventional warfighting capabilities to the emerging technologies and have the potential, which has the potential to transform how business is done. But I guess the point of discussion is, so what does that business look like? What are the themes? How to support it? And what does it mean particularly for the RLC? The blueprint, as CGS has said, again, just to quote him, is for an army that is more expeditionary, more digital, and more dangerous, and one that's going to be much more competitive. Now, I'm sure a lot of you will, if not read everything in detail, will have certainly read the headlines of most of the documents I've mentioned. There are clearly several eye-catching changes that are being made, but the impact on logistics and support and how that will be delivered requires new themes to be addressed, new capabilities, and a refreshed approach. So I'm delighted, really delighted today that we've got such an amazing panel of speakers who can provide some context for us from the strategic, conceptual level right the way through to the practical themes of the Army logistics will face going forward. Firstly, we've got Major General Daryl Amerson, who is currently the Director of Development Concepts and Doctrine, or the Development Concepts and Doctrine Center, effectively Defence's in-house think tank, and driving force with the thinking of the future operating environment. Now, why it's great to have Daryl today is, as I'm sure you all know, he is a logistician of considerable experience and renown. He's commanded at every level up to brigade level, and done so pretty much, as far as I could see and know, on all of the major campaigns of the modern era, culminating in, frankly, the last time I worked with him directly, when he was Commander Joint Force Support in that critical phase in 2014 in Afghanistan, when we ceased combat operations in Helmand, which was a major undertaking. More widely, he served on the directing staff at the Defence Academy, attended the Higher Commander Staff course, served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to Headquarters 3 UK Division, somehow also fitted in attendance at the Royal College of Defence Studies. And on his path to his current job, he was also, and I think really acutely important for our discussions today, the head of Army's logistics, engineering and medical capability. And he has been at DCDC since last year. Now, Daryl is going to address the enduring nature and changing character of conflict, and trying to give us some high-level insight into the logistic and support aspects or issues that perhaps we should be turning our attention to. After General Daryl, we've got Dr. Andrew Curtis, a very old friend of mine, who is also a career logistician during his military career. He currently is in the academic realm, having qualified with a PhD from King's College, and is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute at the moment. But his credentials go back over a 35-year military career in Royal Air Force. He retired in 2019 as an Air Commodore. His final appointment was Program Director of the Defence Support Transformation Programme, which is the flagship transformation initiative of the MOD's Modernising Defence Programme. During his career, he gained considerable operational experience through a variety of appointments: Commander in NATO in the headquarters in Kandahar Airfield, Chief of Staff of the Joint Task Force in Malta that conducted the Libya non-combatant evacuation operation, Commander of the UK military contribution following the Haiti earthquake, and Chief of Staff of the UK National Support Command in Afghanistan. So a huge amount of experience now brought into the academic realm. And Dr. Curtis is going to try and put the context of the change and the future of the IR into the context of how support and I guess support transformation, the thematics that will now affect that going forward and where we should be looking to take that forward. And finally, we've got Colonel Bill Bowman, who is currently the Assistant Head Logistic Policy and Plans in Army Headquarters. So he's responsible for land environment contingent operational stocks, supporting the deployment and sustainment of force elements held at high and very high readiness for operations and contingencies. I'm sure that is a full-on job all day long. But in addition, he's also the program manager for the Sea Mounting Centre at Marchwood, and he's the lead for support assurance of all major Army equipment programs. So no small portfolio. Very lucky to have Bill here today. Really appreciate it. He again is a man of considerable experience before entering into the appointment he's in now. He's been DACO's operational support in land operations, lead logistic, medical and equipment support planner for major Army deployments. He's worked in defence logistic operations and plans in the MOD, and he has also commanded up to regimental level, where he was commander of 10th the Queen's Own Gurkha Logistic Regiment. Bill is going to try and bring this, right down, I guess, into the Army thematics for support, and therefore where that affects the RLC, and try and capture the key themes for us, so we can take a look at how strategic runs down through into Army and then down into RLC and logistics going forward. So each of our speakers is going to present for about 25 minutes or so, and at the end we'll have a chance for some Q&A, which I'll lead. So for all of our attendees, please do use the chat box function whenever you like during the presentations. I will collate your questions, try and group them and marshal them so we can kind of ask them coherently, if you like, in thematics. And we'll bring those to the speakers after Colonel Beaumont's finished his go round the buoy. So without further ado, I am going to pass over to General Darrell, who will give us his presentation. Thank you, Darrell.
Thanks so much indeed, Angus. Can I just check you can hear me first of all?
Yeah, 5 by 5, very good.
Great. And Russ, could you possibly load the first slide, please? Just pop up the first slide. Thank you, Russ. And it's a great pleasure to join everyone on the call this afternoon. And thanks to Angus for the introductory comments. What I hope to do over the next 20-25 minutes or so is to set out, as the slide suggests here, some of the strategic context, I think, which applies to the purpose of today's session. And I'll come at it probably in 3 parts. The first is just to expand on the strategic context, really elaborate on some of the points that Angus has made in the introductory remarks. I'll then look at how sort of the UK and MOD envisage responding to that strategic context, as sort of set out in a number of documents, not least the Integrated Review of the Defence Command paper, and the capstone concept that's really informed Defence's position going into the Integrated Review, which was the integrated operating concept. And then I'll sort of try and sort of tee up Andy really for his piece on really the implications for support, by just from my perspective, trying to illuminate some of the implications, I think, that fall out of this strategic context and response for defence support, and then chunking down to land support as well. So that's really the agenda over the next 20-25 minutes or so. If you could go to the next slide, please, Russ. Just a collage here to try and sort of reflect, if you will, the strategic context within which we are operating and experiencing at the moment. So I think if you were to pick a defining characteristic of this context, it's probably one of instability. And what we seem to be envisaging is an ever-growing complexity, dynamism, and competitiveness in this strategic context. And combined with that, really, quite a rapid evolution of the character of conflicts. And often that is fueled by a couple of things that Angus has mentioned, really. The first is the pervasiveness of information. And the second is the pace of technological change. I think those two are quite significant. And the integrated review sort of set out, if you will, sort of three major features of this context. The first is the geopolitical and geoeconomic shift. And really this was playing to China's increasing rise and growing assertiveness, and arguably the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific. And you'll recall in that policy document that tilt to the Indo-Pacific. The second point that the integrated review spoke about in the Defence Command paper was this sense of competition, systemic competition or persistent strategic competition between states, and the pacing threats for the UK were identified as Russia over the next 10 years, but in the longer term, China, but also this sense of competition which President Biden has spoken about between democracy and authoritarianism. So, if you will, values and systems of government competing over the 21st century. Arguably, that is the grand strategic competition of the 21st century. And then the third area, which again Angus just touched on there, are the transnational challenges that the UK and defence faces, in particular from climate change, biosecurity risks. And I mentioned that within the context of the last 18 months or so with the pandemic, terrorism and serious and organised crime. It was quite interesting in the integrated review that tackling climate change and biodiversity loss was held up as the #1 international priority from a UK perspective. I think the final point I would make about the strategic context is that there is a sense of an ever-growing dilution or erosion, if you will, of strategic stability. And what we're witnessing are nuclear states who are modernizing nuclear capabilities. Some of those states potentially see a use of limited tactical nuclear capabilities on today and the future battlefield. And that is threatening much of the stability in the nuclear or the strategic realm that we've witnessed over recent years, notwithstanding some flashpoints, of course, since the Second World War. We're also seeing new capabilities such as hypersonics and certain dual-use capabilities, particularly in the space arena and in the cyber arena, that again can threaten some of those strategic systems. So there's a risk, if you will, of miscalculation and potentially escalation. So I just raised that point of erosion of strategic stability is something that is an important feature of this context. If we just move on, please, Russ, to the next slide, just to bring this context to life a little bit. 2014, I think, was very interesting. As Angus said, this was the time, of course, we were conducting a transition and the end of combat operations in Afghanistan. And at the same time, we saw the illegal annexation of Crimea, a really significant example, I think, of a fait accompli strategy conducted by Russia through, the cloak of ambiguity and deniability. So this sense of a ghost invasion, both in eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, all wrapped with a very effective information campaign, plausible deniability. And lo and behold, before really the West understood what was going on, through very clever tactics and techniques and very powerful use of information, essentially Russia conducted a fait accompli. So the achievement of strategic objectives below a threshold that we would conventionally understand as requiring a warfighting response. So this is, I think, quite a significant moment, 2014, and the way that Russia used the military instrument to achieve that illegal annexation. If we go to the next slide, please, Russ. So again, just to bring some of this context to life in the way that information and cyber is being used to achieve objectives. I mean, showing here the colonial pipeline that was recently subjected to a ransomware attack by a Russian group called DarkSide. And this, of course, again, brings to life how that information, ones and zeros, and the use of offensive cyber, the use of hacking in, if you will, a virtual sense, can have a very significant physical impact. This is a pipeline that supports the eastern coast of America with about 45% of its aviation and transport fuel, and led to significant outages, significant queues, and ultimately huge loss of reputation, actually, I think, for the company. But a very good example of that integration and link between a virtual and physical effect, again, part of this new context that we need to think about as we seek to compete. And if we go to the next slide, please. In all of this as well, we do have to remember, particularly in terms of supply chains in the business that many of us are in, that geography still matters, and events happen, disruption happens. And of course, this was the Ever Given, part of the Ever Green fleet, Japanese owned, crewed by Indians, that blocked the Suez Canal for a considerable period of time, causing huge disruption to supply chains, in particular for goods moving into Europe from the Far East. So just really important that in all of this change of the information age and the use of different information, which is really necessarily important, that physical issues and geography really do matter when it comes to time, speed, distance, and supply chains. It's, I think, a clear reminder. So if we move to the next slide, please, Russ. In just thinking about that strategic context, therefore, that we've painted, it's important to think how we respond. And the integrated review campaign, the integrated operating concept, we're all really attempting to set out the UK and Defence's response to this context. And in its heart, it's about getting more match fit for a more competitive world. It's about the UK, including defence, playing a more active part in sustaining and shaping a future international order that will almost certainly involve, it will have to accommodate China's rise, also need to shape that rise. And as Angus said, at the heart of this as well, and very timely in the back of the pandemic, was a very significant increase in the commitment to resilience, which I think is very relevant to all those in the support and logistics arena. I think another critical point about this response was that it was absolutely envisaged to be, with our alliances and our key partners, such an important point. And of course, industry is an absolute central component of that. And it also envisaged the UK remaining leading ally, or becoming the leading ally in NATO, and by 2030, the UK being significantly engaged in the Indo-Pacific, getting to that Indo-Pacific tilt point. And of course, we're on the cusp of the Carrier Strike Group conducting freedom navigation passage through the South China Sea in the near future. Let me just turn to defence in a little bit more detail by going to the next slide, please, Russ. And I just want to touch on the integrated operating concept. Just wait for that slide to come up. Brilliant, thanks, Russ. So the integrated operating concept in CDS's mind marks a significant shift in the way that we view and regard, if you will, the application of the military instrument, absolutely alongside other levers of power. And it reflects, or will reflect, or will seek to deliver a very marked shift in our mindset, one that is more assertive, and one that sees the force being used more often, more of the time, in competing below a threshold of what we would recognize as war. So the operating concept itself sees this protect function, engage and constrain, wrapped in what is known as operating. So protecting is the enduring foundation. It underpins everything that we do all of the time, fundamental to deterrence and denial. Engaging, founded really on that forward deployed posture to assure influence, to deter and reassure. It's about understanding as well and gaining insight. Constraining is the most active and assertive part of the operating model that could involve the use of force. But there may well be times, albeit a last resort, when we have to resort to war fighting. And what is really critical for all of us is to understand that that warfighting capability represents still the absolute primary purpose and role of the armed forces. That is unequivocal. So that just gives you a flavor for the concept. There are lots of pan-defense lines of development implications of this. But what I just want to do is to give emphasis to a central idea, which is integration. So to the next slide, please, Ross. Integrated for advantage was really a central idea of this integrated operating concept. And it sees really the force evolving from a joint force to a more integrated force, integrated across 5 operational domains. And the truth is, of course, not all of these domains are equal at the moment. For most of my career, land, maritime, and air has come in truckloads or wheelbarrowfuls. Cyber and electromagnetic and space has come on the back of a postage stamp, and they're all wrapped in the information environment. So we've got a lot of work to do to develop, in particular, cyber and electromagnetic and space into this integrated force. But it is about being more integrated as a force. That was the first lens. And that at the moment is what the MDI, Multi-Domain Integration Change Program, led by General Rob McGowan and Stratcom, is trying to get after through quick wins and building up over time, such that by 2025, we have a data-centric, more integrated force. The second lens that we look at in integration is one of being more integrated across government. And this is a really important point because it views a more integrated approach as being critical to support faster decision-making and more effective policy-making and more coherent implementation. It recognizes that the problems we face at the moment often can't be resolved purely using the military instrument. And we have to be ever more integrated between military and non-military capabilities. So you see in the document, you know, the notions around the integration of defense, diplomacy, development, and intelligence, security, trade, and aspects of domestic policy. And then the third lens that we look at integration is through that with our principal allies and partners. And those partners, of course, critically include academia and industry. Many of the people represented probably on the call today. A fundamental part of this, as Angus mentioned in his opening address. So I just wanted to stress that point of integration and put those 3 lenses on integration of the force with partners across government and with wider allies and partners. If you go to the next slide, please, Russ. Penultimate slide, really, just setting out some of the implications for capability as we look ahead within the context that we've painted. So this sense of smaller, faster capabilities to avoid detection. I mean, you can read through these. I won't read all of them. I would probably identify this top right point about ever more sophisticated networks of systems through that combat cloud that makes best use of the massive data. So the data centricity of this integrated force is hugely important. I would also probably highlight again from a support perspective, it will be a force that's markedly less dependent on fossil fuels and probably more self-sufficient. And will include a mix of crewed, uncrewed, and autonomous platforms. So just a flavor there of some of the implications for capability that are being examined at the moment. And then moving to the final slide, and hopefully I'll come in on about 20 minutes. What I've tried to do here is to identify some, it's not comprehensive, but to try and identify some of the implications for support and logistics, which might just tee up perhaps Andy's talk to an extent. The first thing is this sense of understanding, and clearly information has a huge role to play here, increasingly open source information. But we've got to better understand, I believe, our supply chain. I think that's a really important point, and I'm not sure at the moment truly how well we understand the supply chains and the risk perhaps that might be lurking in those supply chains. Information, of course, has a much broader role as well in terms of information being used to deliver more effective, precise and efficient support in the future. And that clearly is an important issue. I would argue defense has been a very late adopter, if not a laggard, in terms of the use of data, information and AI to truly drive understanding and decision-making and more precise support and effective support. Skills, talent and diversity, I would suggest, are really significant issues as we seek to build this more data-centric integrated force. we can perhaps come back to that point. Climate change and sustainability are going to be ever more significant. The Joint Requirements Committee at the moment is looking at how do we best bring in those climate change and sustainability issues to capability decision making. And it's probably just worthy of note here. We have to think about both adaptation, the way military capability is adapted to deal in a climate stressed world. And I'll just give you one example of that. As the Arctic, for instance, some of the Arctic ice begins to melt, then there is probably going to be a requirement to have ships that have the ability to pass through what is known as disruptive ice. So that is the ice that sits between hard ice and open water. And if we don't have that sort of capability, then arguably we're going to lose operational advantage. So it's about adapting to a more climate stressed world, but it's also about mitigating the impact of our own footprint, i.e. the point about sustainability. And to a certain extent, particularly outside of existential threats or non-discretionary operations, we may be denied our license to operate unless we have a sustainable footprint that is acceptable to the hosts that we're seeking to engage with and support. So I think, you know, these are going to become significantly more important issues. And I think it's today actually the government released their decarbonisation strategy for transport. Resilience, big issue around how do we build resilience, diversification of supply, perhaps bringing in more small and medium-sized enterprises, mid-tier suppliers. I do think, though, it's going to be a mix of global and local. It's not just about onshoring. I think we're too integrated for that. It's a mix of global and local. We need to think really hard about readiness and anticipatory stocks, words that have been used, but we haven't necessarily had the investment into readiness or anticipatory stock. I would argue we need to sort of shift the dial such that appropriate levels of stock become seen as capability, not overhead. Adaptation and self-sufficiency, I would argue the speed of adaptation may well determine or deliver decisive advantage. And we probably need to think more about risk mitigation, expecting disruptions and aiming off for them. And I think there's a tendency for us to think often about cost reduction or revenue increase. We have to start thinking also about risk mitigation. But often the link between risk mitigation and return on investment is not necessarily as clear as the other two. Integration I've touched on, public and private, massive role for industry in this. I think we'll be ever more integrated with our industry partners, I think unquestionably so. Domestic overseas integration, physical virtual integration. We're going to have to become really good and effective at commercial contracting, and we have to review the commercial processes and policies. And I'm really pleased to see in the draft defense strategy, PUS and CDS really trying to get after that point. And I think we're going to have, you know, with more of the force, more in use more of the time, increased points of presence, prioritized around the globe. We won't be everywhere all of the time, but in priority regions and priority nations. And I think, you know, this will provide both opportunities in terms of support, but also challenges as well. So that's really a flavor to finish with as I sort of conclude now, hopefully at about the 25-minute mark, and hand back, I think, to possibly Angus or to Andy, I'm not sure, but thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Daryl. I'll just go on very briefly and go straight to Andy Curtis and look forward to your comments, Andy.
Angus, thank you very much. And also thanks to General Daryl, because I think that was a really good introduction at the strategic level, just to give us a flavour for what's going on, if you like, above us in the logistics and support space. I'll keep at the sort of pan defence level for my section. but I will focus in on that logistics and support space. I'll talk a little bit about where logistics and support is today, which should lead into the transformation of defence support, which is underpinned by the defence support strategy. Some of you will be more aware of that than others. But I want to spend the bulk of my time actually looking at how well that strategy is likely to succeed, and those things that might make it fail, perhaps to tee up some questions in the Q&A session at the end. And I think General Dowell's final slide was really very useful, certainly for kicking off my work. And in fact, the final bullet, increased points of presence, more of the force, more in use, more of the time. Because there is a suggestion that actually the integrated review and the Defence Command paper will reduce the burden on logistics and support. I've certainly been involved in a number of discussions with academics over the last 6 months, and there is a view out there that actually all is sweetness and light within the support environment because the force structure is going down, therefore the logistics and support task is going down. I think the opposite is true. I think if you look at the IOPS's concept of persistent competition, and that document defines that, and I'm quoting now, a campaign posture that includes continuous operating on our terms and in places of our choosing. Will, I think if you look at that and what that actually means for logistics and support, it's going to increase the burden. Over the last 10, 15 years, the campaign activity in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, that was difficult logistics, but it wasn't complex logistics. One supply chain, if you like, one coupling bridge, known supply lines of communication, challenging, but known supply lines of communication. That's going to change. With bands of determined men and women deployed around the globe now, we're going to be looking at multiple coupling bridges, significant numbers of logistic hubs, all of which have different demands on them. I think the future will increase the logistics and support requirement, because in addition to that, don't forget that all of the standard missions and tasks that we're all familiar with, they're all in the integrated review as well. None of those have gone away. So this is activity in addition to all of the standard missions and tasks that we're very familiar with. If you want more information about that, a really good source is Christian Bro's The Kill Chain. If you've read it, you'll know. If you haven't, you might want to. But certainly he focuses in great detail about the implications across defence activity that this new way of working will bring. So I think it's pretty obvious that that the work is going up, it's not going down. But in addition to that, there is still a problem space, a legacy problem space for support. Now that problem space you can take all the way back to the introduction of jointery and the end of the Cold War. I'd love to do that. I certainly don't have the time today, but I will step back as far as SDSR 15, because SDSR 15 introduced a step change increase in defence's ambition. The main one that you will all be familiar with is the return to divisional warfighting. But there were increases in our ambition to deliver military effect across all areas of operations. What there wasn't, though, was any uptick in support. In fact, logistics was ignored completely. in the 95 pages of the document, the word logistics was only used once, and that was referring to Navy support ships. So that's a problem for logistics and support. In addition, that SDSR identified almost £12 billion worth of efficiencies that needed to be delivered. Now, if you've got a support budget that's about a third of the entire defence budget, it's not rocket science to work out where a lot of those efficiencies are going to come from. So if you like, you've got that perfect storm of the ask going up, but the resource going down. So that was definitely an outcome of SDSR 15. And that is what led General Angus in his final appointment to push the Defence Logistics Board into creating the Defence Support Network Transformation Programme. And I give that a shout out purely because that's what created the construct that we've got today. The 3-star Chief of Defence Logistics and Support, the Defence Support Organisation as part of UK Stratcom, came about because of that work. Now that organisation has not been standing still since it formed a year to 18 months ago. They have identified some significant problem areas within support. And those of you who have been around logistics for decades, and I'm sure that there are a number of you out there who have, you'll recognise some of these that I'm just going to throw out and list. I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but these are the challenges that logistics and support are facing today. We've talked about seeking the financial savings and the impact. Angus has talked about the strategic base and the resilience issues there. But there are also some quite real problems around availability, around productivity, around efficiency, and linked to that, cost of ownership problems. We've all seen capability being brought into service without enough resource to support it. Straight away, you're into trade-offs. Almost always one of those trade-offs is downstream support. And then you get downstream and you find the support isn't there. So either you end up with a reduced capability or you have to reinvest. Quite often that reinvestment costs more than the saving that was taken out up front. Poor data and analytics. I'm sure a lot of people here are scarred by log-IS issues. I'm sure a number of you have actually been involved in programs and projects to deliver log-IS. I don't think defence is short on data. There is a lot of occasions where we are able to gather data. I think more the problem is we're not able to use that data to our advantage and to actually analyse it to support our decision making. So another problem area there. And then the final two, and bear in mind that these are problems identified by CDLS and his team. These are not my problems that I've dreamt up myself. Insufficient strategic direction. It's interesting that the feeling at that level is that decisions are made within the support arena that don't necessarily take, not necessarily aware of everything that's going on at the strategic level, but vice versa. There are definitely decisions being made within other capability areas that are not aware of what's going on in the support space. And then finally, people, and Angus and General Darrell both mentioned, people issues, but the world is changing very quickly. The servicemen and women that are joining logistics and support trades now are very different to those of us that joined 35 plus years ago. And actually making sure that they are influencing the future is really quite important. And that's something that is definitely recognised within that sort of problem space area. So if you look at the situation we've got now, we've got an up arrow in terms of defence needing support, and yet support has got an awful lot of its own problems that it's got to put right. And so how do you solve that? Well, the traditional way is to look at a transformation activity of some sort. That's exactly what CDLS has done. He's developed a defence support strategy, a 15-year strategy, and again I'm quoting, built around a vision to deliver a substantial improvement in equipment availability and assured logistics services that are cost-effective and environmentally sustainable. Again, I go back to the points I raised a couple of minutes ago. How much of that have we heard before? Well, probably apart from the environmentally sustainable bit, none of that is new. These are not new problems that the Defence Support Organisation is trying to solve. And the way it's going about it, again, is quite traditional in terms of the strategy. A very simple ends, ways and means construct, 5 near-term strategic outcomes that are quite strongly aligned to those problem spaces, absolutely as you would expect them to be. So by 2025-26, the priority areas for CDLS: optimise and rationalise the strategic base, modernise and transform business processes, instill and exploit through-life asset management, experiment and accelerate support advantage. I'll come back to support advantage in just a second, and recognise and professionalise support people. Now, if you're sort of picking up a theme here, then that's good, because the theme is that most of these problems that the 3-star is looking to solve are problems that we have been looking to solve for probably the last 25 to 30 years. What's different now is it sits within this new approach, the new IOPSI and the new integrated approach to delivering military effect. And that is a change, and that is a change that will help the delivery of defence support, I have no doubt. And if you like, the key strapline, the what's new is the idea of securing support advantage. And again, if I quote CDLS from his strategy launch event, he defines support advantage as the ability of UK defence to be able to outcompete its near-peer enemies by its key equipment capabilities being more available more of the time when and where they are needed, as well as possessing support chains that are more resilient than those of its potential adversaries. So if you like, that is the aiming point for the defence support strategy. And those strategic outcomes, those big 5 big ticket items are at the macro level where the Defence Support Organisation is going to achieve them. What I'd like to do now for the last sort of 10 minutes or so is just consider how likely that is to succeed and what are the issues that are going to affect it. And I think if I look first at why that approach might succeed, well, the key things that fall out for me is the methodology that's being used. And I accept that there's a bit of sort of OCD here around construct and around everything fitting together properly. But actually, when it comes to delivering transformation change, that's really quite important. So the very fact that there is a strategy supported by a functional plan that actually is not just a single piece of shelfware, but is being annually reviewed and updated, is being underpinned by the application of PTM principles, so portfolio, programme and project management, is a big thing. It's actually quite a new thing that the DSNT programme was probably the first within the support organisation to insist on that sort of approach. But the very fact that you've got the recognition that what's written down on day one is not going to survive contact, especially in the current dynamic world that we're living in today, actually is a big advantage. And a good example of that is if you've read the defence support strategy, there's very little about industry involvement. This is a journey that can't be completed without industry. And yet actually the first iteration of the strategy is quite industry light. Now, if you speak to CDLS, there's a reason for it. There were a lot of internal hurdles that he had to get over simply to get the strategy accepted. And as a result, it was a very inwardly facing document. But the next iteration will cover off industry issues. So there you have a really good example of this methodology working in his favour. Another point that is worth highlighting is the opportunity. I mean, this is a really good time to be doing transformational change. Timing is everything. And actually the time is right for this work. The fact that it's been underpinned by the DSNT programme is really helpful. It put it first in the queue of defence transformation activities. It was the first to get EXCO and IAC approval. And it also lines up very well with other strategies and other approaches, pan defence. General Darrell talked about IOPSI and Net Zero 50, the Sustainability Challenge. Actually, the approach to defence support lines up very well with those. So it is of its time, and that opportunity is really quite important. And then finally, the buy-in of the logistic and support community. Actually, you can expand that to the buy-in from the top of defence downwards. And that is crucial, because if CDS and the PermSec are not bought into this approach, it is going to stutter and struggle when it comes to actually delivering the effect that, that the 3 stars after. But also, if it doesn't have the buy-in of the logistic community across the frontline commands and in the delivery organisations, it's not going to get past the start line. So the fact that that buy-in is really quite visible now is a real strength. Unfortunately, there are a number of weaknesses as well. There are a number of reasons why this approach might fail. And the first one is a mix of scope, of size, and of complexity. By attacking this problem as defence support, i.e. by bringing in logistics and engineering into this problem space, you really do broaden the problems, the issues that you are tackling that you have got to get after. So not only does that make the scope really broad, but you then have an interpretation issue. When I talk about defence support, the person next to me is going to be talking about it in a slightly different way. The person next to him or her, again, in a slightly different way. So actually making sure everybody is on the same page and everybody is delivering against the plan, that's a full-time job in itself. And the complexity is quite significant as well. I'm just going to find an example, if I can, of the complexity. So I mentioned one of the strategic outcomes is optimize and rationalize the strategic base. If you just look at one piece of activity, so the example I'm going to give you is the activation of vehicles from Ashchurch, the MOD depot, and moving them to the seaport of embarkation. Now that's only a small part of a potential outload plan, but when you model that, that involves 470 interdependent activities owned by 41 different actors. We have made the defence support network so complicated now that for that activity to work, all of those things have to line up. And that's just one example. So the complexity of this is really quite significant. Another issue is lack of resources. Now, I understand that CDLS has actually received confirmation that what he's asked for under the latest planning round for support transformation, he has got. And that's a good thing, but there's no guarantee that he's going to keep that. If you look at just within UK Stratcom, if you look at other pressures on the budget, special forces, defence digital, the military's contribution to the National Cyber Force are just three that spring to mind. A lot of people will say they're higher priority than defence support. And so he's going to struggle to keep hold of the money that he's got. And if he loses any of that, that is just going to reduce the amount of transformational change that he can deliver. The next issue to highlight is process and policy and process, and they are weak. Defence is not an organisation that is good at delivering transformational change. And that's not really something that you should expect to be a surprise. It's a big, heavy bureaucratic organisation that is not designed to accept swift change. If you look at the defence operating model, it's skewed towards output owners, frontline commands delivering capability. It's not skewed towards cross-cutting owners of process like the functional owners, CDLS, the CIO, etc. So defence is not configured to deliver this change. And the fourth and final issue that I believe is going to be a real stumbling block is simply the lack of defence-wide staying power. Defence collectively gets very bored very quickly. This is an activity that's not going to be delivered in weeks and months. It's going to be delivered in months and years. And yet, traditionally, on the turnover of personnel, things change. The new man or woman comes in and wants to do his or her own thing. And the way that defence is constructed only goes to support that sort of approach. And a really good example of that is the Modernising Defence Programme. Less than 2 years old, the Mobilise, Modernise and Transform strapline underpinned everything. It was going to be the way ahead for the next 10 years. Then the integrated review came out, and those three words were nowhere to be seen. It had been dropped completely because it was somebody else's plan, somebody else's idea. And so if defence can do that at that level, then there is a real danger that sticking with something as important as defence support, but that is going to take a long time to deliver, is going to be a very, very vulnerable undertaking. So where does that leave us? I mean, I would argue that defence support is potentially facing a burning platform. If you look at those problems, if you look at what is expected of it. But in response, CDLS's strategy and the associated functional plan has identified the problem space, conveys a picture of what the future should look like, and sets out a direction of travel to get there. Those are all positives. And I believe with a fair wind and strong leadership, much of that change will be delivered. But I also don't believe it will all be delivered, because I don't believe that CDLS on his own is able to do that. I think it will only be delivered if big defence does three things. First, defence must embrace the criticality of support as a key enabler of operational advantage. And it's then, by doing so, it's got to wholeheartedly commit to the long-term nature of the defence support strategy that's been put in place to deliver that change. Then it's got to back that up with meaningful ring-fenced investment in support of support's own infrastructure, technology and people. And finally, it must empower CDLFs to deliver on that strategy. And I firmly believe that unless defence goes all in, then the transformation of support will always, always be beyond its reach. I'd be very interested to hear your views in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Some strong thoughts from an academic perspective there. Let's bring this down to the practical, though, and move across to Colonel Bill Beaumont, who will talk us through the Army Headquarters perspective of support and potentially the themes that we should be thinking of in the RLC in light of the IR and the Defence Command paper. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks, sir. Can I just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yeah, got you 5x5.
Brilliant, thank you. Look, firstly, I'm rather flattered to be asked to contribute to the discussion today. Having attended several RLC Foundation events in the past, I'm aware of the quality of speakers on a wide variety of topics that are relevant to the core. And I think that's certainly been reflected today in the presentations by General Darrell and Andy, and I've sort of been scribbling furiously here with my notes. I'm also aware that the standard of questions that follows usually demonstrates real insight from the audience, and having had a chance to look through those attending, I'm quite looking forward to the discussion that follows, because I think, you know, already there are themes which I will probably echo, which have been raised already. I mean, building on that conversation thus far, I'm going to look to provide that Army-focused assessment of the IR, the implications of this, and how we as logisticians are likely to play our part going forward. And really, I intend to do this by covering a number of topic areas, which should then provide that fuller picture. So firstly, what does the IR mean to the Army in big handfuls? Then briefly, what does the IR mean in terms of Army readiness? And already heard General Darrell mention about readiness. To discuss how we might sustain the force going forward, before covering how we might practice this readiness, including forward basing of fleets and stocks, and also the supporting the development of the Agile stance campaign plan, which I know a number of the attendees today will be very familiar with. What I won't be able to do today, though, is to provide a breakdown of what the detailed structures of the Army, or indeed the RLC, are to deliver against the IR going forward. And really, this is for two key reasons. The first of which is that under Project Embankment, there's work ongoing to finalise the Army organ structures against workforce planning, equipment and infrastructure planning, and also ensuring that the future structures for the Army are being checked against the Army's financial envelope to make sure that they're sustainable. And importantly, to ensure that we can still meet the requirements of the force generation schedule, or the operations commitments plot in old money. Some of you will have heard about Embankment. It's really about getting the Army to the start line post-IR. Separate to this, but linked, is a strategic estimate being conducted again in the Army Headquarters alongside Embankment, which is looking at how we maintain the structures and how we adapt the Army and its outputs out to 2030 and even out to 2035, noting that this will still need to be shaped every 5 years by follow-on integrated reviews. The second reason that I'm not going to cover organisations and structures in any detail is because CGS is due to speak to the Army chain of command down to commanding officer level about this specific topic on Friday. And because I quite enjoy my current job, and it's quite nice having a pay packet at the end of every month as well as my pension, I'd like to continue to do so. So it would be a bit foolhardy of me to try and preempt any announcements by CGS, particularly as much of this detail will be sensitive and compartmented whilst it undergoes its final scrubs until it's released by General Mark on Friday. What I can say, though, is that we in the RLC should be reassured that senior officers from our corps have been engaged in org work. So they're well aware of what has been going on and have been able to engage in this process. I think we should also be reassured that this work's been done in recognition of the joint enabling capabilities that we in the Army provide and the demand that's placed on the Corps by Defence. So some reassurance there, and I think following Friday we'll have a much clearer picture about which subunits and units are sitting within which BCTs and alongside which corps and divisions. That said, what does the IR mean for the Army in big handfuls? So I think everyone will have seen the IR headlines in terms of organisation, a move to heavy BCTs rather than strike, although note that the focus on agility, mobility, and flexibility of those of that as a concept endures. We will have light brigade combat teams, a deep strike recce brigade combat team, which is a relatively new structure, the air maneuver BCT, which sort of leads on from 16 Air Assault Brigade, and then of course the Security Force Assistance Brigade and the Army Special Ops Brigade, which has the Ranger Regiment concept at its heart. I suppose more importantly for us, it's of note that there are Ops Sustain brigades and a Theatre Sustainment Brigade. So in terms of the current construct, I'm alluding to there in terms of brigades for Ops Sustain and then one for Theatre Sustainment. Again, this should be a cause for reassurance, and that mix of regular and reserve members of the Corps and across the Army will still remain key to deliver the operational outputs that we're under remit to provide. We know that the Army will reduce in size from 82,000 to 72,500, but I think it's important to understand there'll be no redundancy program associated with this. Managed routine outflow and workforce prioritisation will help the Army focus on the trades and capabilities it'll need going forward in both the regular and reserve components. We know in terms of budget that Defence has been allocated an additional £24 billion from the Treasury, and the Army share of this is being finalised at the moment. But as has been raised by Andy and some of the points that I'll raise, you know, if we move to a process where there is increased readiness and a focus on being deployed more of the time, of course, that's not a free good. And in terms of equipment, I mentioned it with the heavy BCTs. We know that we've made a commitment to introduce a number of major equipment platforms, including Challenger 3, the Ajax armoured vehicle, and the Boxer armoured troop carrying vehicle. But I suppose the focus here is not actually on the equipment themselves, although they'll be state of the art. It's the reach, agility, and the options militarily that these capabilities provide that's important. I think more importantly, though, is that the IR reinforced an ambitious vision for the future role of the military as part of a global Britain. And much of the drive to secure increased defence funding was linked to the technological transformation required to deliver this. General Angus, you've already mentioned, but CGS himself in an interview with the Daily Telegraph last month stated that the Army is about to undergo its most radical changes since the 1930s mechanisation programme. That transformation from mechanisation to digitalisation forthcoming is going to fundamentally change the way that the Army does business. At the same time, though, CGS acknowledged that it's not possible to wish away the traditional threats that still manifest themselves in the way that we saw with a very overt display of Russian hard power on the Ukrainian border earlier this year. The key aim of the Army's transformation going forward, though, is that it's able to harness that conventional warfighting capability and emerging technologies in order that we have that blueprint that you mentioned for an Army that's more expeditionary, digital, and more dangerous, and will certainly be more competitive in future. So whilst conventional warfare has not gone away, there is a sense that its character is changing and that artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics are already starting to be felt on the future battlefield. And recent small-scale engagements around the world, whether that be in Yemen, whether that be in Syria, whether that be elsewhere, has demonstrated the ability to use alternative technological and digitized warfare to achieve competitive advantage. In order that we have an Army that's sharper, more competitive, and more lethal, I think we need to be aware that it needs to be optimized for the digital age and not the industrial one. So there'll be changes in how the Army is structured and how it engages globally. And already we've seen growth in cyber and information maneuver capabilities. And as part of the IR, a growth in information maneuver groups to support the fighting elements. But also with the Special Operations Brigade and the Rangers Regiment, that vanguard for partnerships with new allies around the world. We will see more of the Army deployed more of the time under the integrated operating concept that General Darrell highlighted during his presentation, with that increased focus on protect, engage, and constrain activities, rather than perhaps our traditional approach, which was focused around war fighting and training for that. And how this will materialise is likely to be with a closer alignment of exercises and deployments within regional framework areas as part of this. So, for example, exercises in Eastern Europe or West Africa could support the narrative and activities in regions where we also have troops deployed on operations. And that provides an interesting relationship with PGHQ managing joint operations and the Land Operations Command potentially leading those deployments as part of the IOPSI framework. In terms of what does the IR mean for Army readiness? Well, I suppose without going into the detail of individual force element readiness, there's an overarching drive from the IR to hold increasingly more Army capabilities at a greater level of readiness than at present. And what's important to this is that readiness is not a free good. So from my perspective, more stock needs to be managed, maintained, and available more of the time. And this is a move away from our current business as usual approach and our quest for efficient logistics. The IR referenced the use of global hubs in Germany, Kenya, Oman, and Brunei, as well as existing ones in Cyprus and Belize, in order to support regional operations, but also to enable the Army to deploy at a speed of relevance. So that is to get to the operation fast enough to make a difference. And we'll maintain the ability to deploy light forces at extremely high readiness. But I think once the next edition of the AOO is published, the Army Operating Order is published, we'll see that we'll retain scalable capabilities up to divisional warfighting at readiness. Now, General Darrell spoke about stocks held forward, and I agree wholeheartedly that these should be considered an asset rather than an overhead. Using our global hubs, it's reasonable to expect that we look to hold stocks forward to varying degrees. And of course, these stocks will have to be managed effectively. And how we might do this is an area of ongoing work. We're also undertaking to ensure that the material and equipment held at readiness is appropriate. And the majority of people on the call are probably aware that we have a Force Elements at Readiness program that ensures that we have the correct standard stock modules and priming equipment packs available that are resourced and available in timelines required. We're also refreshing the resource demands for follow-on stocks to sustain operations at reach as part of the Force Elements at Sustainability Reset. And again, it's worth noting that for some of the force elements that we're looking at, FVTS is an expensive decision which we're asking the Army to consider. And once we have full awareness post the strategic estimate, we intend to go to a balance of investment with the Army where there'll be a series of options by which we'll prioritise and then resource the force elements at readiness and sustainment stocks to support deployable force elements. So I suppose it's worth thinking about how we sustain this force, noting it's going to be deployed, or the intent is that it's deployed more regularly and to more places. One of the concepts being developed to look at this is known as Agile Sustainment in Land Operations, which builds on something called the Future Land Combat System. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but I'll perhaps give you a flavour for some of the themes within that. So essentially, it looks at the ability to generate sustainment effect without the need to have mass sustainment elements. And this is important because I've noticed that many IOPSI deployments, and there will be many, will operate at relatively small scale and will be dispersed on extended lines of communication. So the current sort of predominantly analog land sustaining capability that we have, which is push focused, reactive, dependent on fossil fuels, and has sort of limited integration capability, isn't really going to cut the mustard for this new strategic construct. So land sustainment is going to have to transform, and there's going to have to be a bit of experimentation here as well. Essentially, we're going to need to modernise to support an increasingly data-driven future land combat system. We're going to have to operate dispersed and at greater tempo, with greater reach and endurance across that protect, engage, constrain, fight, IOPSI framework. And then we're going to have to baseline the development of requirements to sustain the future force. the need to embrace resilience and data-centric technology is fundamental to all this. And, you know, there's work ongoing to talk about sensors and connectivity and data distribution. And there is work ongoing in terms of artificial intelligence and robotic and autonomous systems. We're going to have the skills and experience and the knowledge to manipulate those systems effectively. And there's really a bit of a step change there in how we, as a core, do our business, I think. We are a technical core. Arguably, we will have to become more technical. And in discussion, someone did say to me, I think this is more IT than CATSy. And I wouldn't take that sort of glibly and at face value. You know, we will certainly still be required to conduct the last mile deployment for distribution operations. But it'll have to be done by an intelligent soldier or officer, able to analyze data from multiple feeds, able to assess and analyze risks and threats in a way that perhaps we're not doing at the moment, and without the tools that we have, without the tools that we have currently, but tools which will enable that recognized logistic picture that we've been talking about for so long. It really will have to come into place. Importantly, though, the source of that data may well be the warfighter themselves rather than the supporting logistic elements. And putting the warfighter at the heart of that sort of digital supply chain, having data from that individual which feeds and is analysed automatically through AI will enable us to respond appropriately and efficiently to their requirements. To illustrate what this might look like, I suppose a right of arc could be on a deployed operation in a remote, dusty place. We may choose to put forward something that looks like a secure Amazon collection point. And the data that we receive from the warfighter enables that to be replenned or resupplied remotely, and a rendezvous is enabled with the warfighter, who is able to then draw upon that effectively secure dump. But an Amazon collection point could be essentially you know, what we're talking about. In terms of deployed land sustainment, I mean, ground forces at reach, dispersed and in isolated locations are just going to have to be more resilient and self-sustaining. The pressures of the extended lines of communication on personnel and equipment support will require those practices, procedures and equipment currently held perhaps at sort of second line being delivered much closer to the point of need, but risk informed. So an army that can drive fundamental demand reduction across the force will benefit from extended operational reach and improved platform and device energy efficiency and less dependence on logistic overheads. And that's certainly a lesson that we're learning in places like Mali at the moment. In terms of distribution and supply, a land supply chain that's resilient, robust and agile will rely on that recognised logistic picture that I mentioned earlier. And alongside that, the automated and digitised data collection, transmission and storage, which can then be analysed by AI to provide a coherent and credible forecast of usage. Of course, key to this is having data which is reliable. And I think that plays to something raised by Andy in terms of we do need to focus now on how we get cleaner and better data, and better still, how we're able to enable our systems to talk to each other, noting that some of our systems, legacy systems, are quite creaky. There are other systems oncoming, such as BMFS, Business Management for Support in Future, but matching those alongside the ability to have total visibility is something we're really going to have to focus on. Sorry, excuse me, the phone's going at the moment. It's normally the Amazon warehouse man.
We are not available now. Please leave your
name
and phone number after the beep.
This drive down on sustainment requirements echoes something that CGS has mentioned and raised, and also something that General Nugi has also mentioned. And that's about the requirement to embrace the advantages of green energy. And this sort of coming revolution in green energy will play out in the sustainment space, as there's an advantage to our logistic operations through not just reduced fuel demand, but improved battery life, and therefore significant sustainability advantage for a fielded force in whatever IOPSI role they're in when it's deployed can be achieved. Moving forward, I suppose it's worth considering how we assure and validate readiness, because increasingly we should expect to see a drive on assuring and validating the Army's ability to deploy within its designated readiness profiles. And we as a Corps will be included in that as well. So already we're starting to activate standard stock modules to support Army deployments to improve the at-readiness sustainment firing chain. And we're going to continue to do this going forwards. We should see and should expect to see the use of PEPs and standard stock modules, as well as forward-held stocks more routinely as part of any deployment process, rather than just as an emergency break glass activity for warfighting. Of course, what we'll have to understand as part of that firing chain is where the requirement for financial authorities are, and also what we can and can't consume in activities other than operations. But there's certainly a desire to test this, particularly amongst our extremely high readiness forces, but across the whole gamut of force elements that are currently held at readiness and alongside major operations, major exercises. So the Army Operating Order, which some people will not be aware of, but it's the replacement of the Army Readiness Order, will reintroduce the requirement for force elements to assure and validate their breakout and pre-deployment procedures, including stored operational and equipment fleets. And we should be comfortable that RLC units will have a role in this as both deploying force elements, but also as key enablers to deliver this. And I think it's a real opportunity to demonstrate our professional prowess, capability, and utility. As part of this, the Army is well engaged with the development of the Agile Stance Campaign Plan, which is a CDS-directed activity to validate and test, amongst other things, Defence's ability to plan, command and control, and execute strategic base outload activities at increasing pace and scale over the period 2021 to 2024. So our RLC elements within the theatre enabling groups as part of 104 Brigade have already been contributing to this as part of the Defender series of exercises conducted this year and previously. And we're able to draw on a wealth of valuable lessons from unit to commercial partner level to ensure that there's an incremental improvement and a better understanding of where areas of friction are in order that we can address these by the time we get to 2024. I mean, this is absolutely a shared defence endeavour and something that the Army is committed to. In fact, there was a meeting this morning driving that forward with Strat. Wider defence support transformation will support this, and I've already mentioned that the business management for support IS that will enable the Army to link into the responsive sustainment network will be key to this, to better understand where our risks are, how we can manage them, and where we can deploy stock at pace and scale. I think in short, we should expect to be more engaged to demonstrate readiness at whatever level we are operating at, whether that's in the headquarters, whether that's at unit level, within our commercial partners, regular or reserve. So, I mean, I've spoken for a little while now and I've covered a few areas, but I suppose just to make sure I haven't lost you along the way, I'll just recap on some of the areas I wanted to cover. So the first of which was, to explain what the IR means to the Army in big handfuls, but also in terms of Army readiness. And then to discuss how in future we might sustain such a force, particularly at reach, a small force as part of an IOPSI framework. Also then look to cover how we might practice readiness and assure and validate that, including our work ongoing, looking at the forward basing of fleets and stocks and supporting the development of the Agile Stance Campaign Plan. But before I hand back to General Angus, I thought I'd offer you a few of my so whats in terms of what I think the Corps could expect to see in future. I mean, there's no doubt that there's significant change on the horizon to transform to the requirements of the Army going forward. But without wishing to sound cheesy, I think as a technical corps, we're well placed to do this. And I'm sure that we'll be able to reinforce this post-IR. If anything, we'll become a more technical corps. And, I mentioned that sort of IT rather than CATSI. I think having a better informed and intelligent practitioner is something that we absolutely will close with, and we're well placed to do so. Amongst the changes within the IR, the development of the Special Ops Brigade and that range of capability does offer a real opportunity for our brightest and our best logisticians to shine in high-profile areas, whether that's at 1LO or indeed whether that's working alongside and in support of that Special Ops Brigade. They're going to be very busy. I mean, Agile stance is something you absolutely are going to hear about more in the near future. It's a deliberately challenging campaign plan to prove strategic base outload capabilities, and it's gathering momentum across each of the TLBs and is being driven by CDS himself. So, it's not going to go away. It's a really good mechanism experiment to try, fail, improve, but importantly, deliver when it really counts. And we will all be engaged in that, whether at unit level or headquarters level going forward. And I would just ask that people approach it in that manner, that it's there so that collectively we can work to articulate where those wrinkles are that perhaps we've been aware of but never really closed with, but to improve the end result. And I suppose finally, Agile Sustainment provides real scope for the Corps to seize opportunities to modernise and demonstrate its utility. The Army may well be more deployed more of the time and more globally, but the Corps' role in sustaining these forces from the strategic base to the deployed space will continue to be critical, not just to the Army, but to defence more widely, as it always has been. And I think there, sir, I'll probably pause and then look to pick up any points and questions.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. I think everybody online will agree, 3 fantastic presentations packed full of, a whole raft of different issues at different levels there, and the questions are starting to pile in now. Have no fear, Bill, as one wag just said, that was not CGS on your telephone about to ask you what you're talking about, and we won't draw you on the issues that are frankly sub judice at the moment. I will actually kick off because it's the chairman's prerogative with the first question, and then I'll take some of the questions in order, although some of them have the same themes. And my question really came out of, I think, listening to General Darrell, and I always listen for the most used word, and the most used word is integrated or integration. And it did strike me there's some conflict between integration and resilience, depending on how far you take this word integrated for advantage. So resilience, I think, has started to mean more control of in-house assets and being able to be master of destiny more clearly. And yet we've got a policy that says more out there doing more things in more places. And one of the things that has really struck me since I entered the commercial world is just how strong and resilient commercial networks are. And therefore, where does industry meet defense in integration for advantage? And I guess how does that relate to not just what we have described in the past as the whole force, may still be describing it as the whole force, but the real depth. So in other words, my resilience is your operational outcome. And I might just ask General Darrell to kick off with some thoughts on that and then come to the other 2 speakers.
Yeah, can you hear me, Angus?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. And I think a really important question. So integration, as I mentioned, through 3 lenses, and the purpose really is about fundamentally being more effective. So in light of the challenges and problems that we face, I think specifically turning to resilience, in a way, this is deterrence by denial, but it's also about the ability to withstand shocks and disruption and to respond effectively in the face of shocks and disruption. And I think this is where possibly we can learn an awful lot actually from industry, because I think there have been many disruptions over the last 10 or 20 years. Clearly, we're living through one at the moment, the pandemic, but actually there have been many, not least the financial crisis and other pandemics. One could point to cyber attacks and what have you. So part of, I think, resilience from a support perspective, a logistic perspective, is really understanding in depth, in some sophistication, supply chains in a way that perhaps we haven't for a period of time. So really thinking through disruptions and really think scenarios and disruptions, really thinking through potential vulnerabilities in supply chains and how those potential vulnerabilities might be mitigated. And I think there's a lot there that could bring industry and defense together if we're really serious about resilience, if we're really serious about being able to better withstand shocks and respond effectively. Just touching on another aspect of this from an operational perspective, more of the force being used more of the time in different places of the world. I think, again, this is another area where resilience really will come into force quite markedly in terms of the ability to sustain a long-term operation. Because I think, and Bill touched on this, we have to think about engagement from a long-term perspective. We have to think strategically, and we can't be everywhere all of the time. We have to prioritize. And I think in terms of the way we look to support those operations, and this is why I think it's such a brilliant time to be a logistician, I think we can think really innovatively with industry to determine the best way to support what I think will be more of the force used more of the time in different places. So I think there's a real chance here for innovation, a real chance to develop resilience and maybe reduce reliability on our supply chains by perhaps looking at more organic options within a particular theatre or country alongside industry. So I think industry's got a huge role to play in this, would be my perspective. And I sense we could also learn an awful lot from industry in light of what industry has experienced and how industry has responded in the last 18 months, but also the way they've handled disruptions over the last 10, 15 years or so.
Thanks, Darryl. Andy, any views from you on that subject?
So I mean, I think I would probably just add one point to that, and it's a note of caution around terminology in general. If you think back to when jointery was the big thing, so many occasions, and we've all experienced it, where people applied the joint tag to their pet project and suddenly the funding flowed. My worry is if we're not very obvious and clear about what we mean by both integration and resilience, recognizing clearly that they're different things, there is a danger of the same thing happening. And I know this isn't specifically answering the question, but it does leak into the industry space because I think they are as guilty of it as the military. But I think we just have to make sure that we know what we are talking about and we know where the priorities are as we move towards an integrated force and as we try and make our supply network more resilient, that we don't just fall foul and throw funding at, he who shouts loudest and uses the buzzwords best. And I think, that's perhaps quite a simple thing that if we can get right, we might look back and say, actually, we managed the transition into this integrated space in a much better way than we did when we transited into the joint space after the Cold War.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I have to say, I did write down when Daryl was speaking, he was talking about integration for advantage, and I wrote down the phrase beyond joint, you know, so what does that mean? It's very interesting. Bill, I'll just come to you quickly for any particular view.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of difficult to see how we couldn't deliver this without industry, given the skill sets they've got. I think sort of the challenges that have been raised are well recognised. And within the Army headquarters, we've just undergone a restructuring which sees programmes collectively brought under a director programmes, which helps to provide a degree of coherence, which perhaps we didn't have before. Was it in info, de-info's area? Was it in another area? Because the challenges of how do you knit everything together, how do you get that integration is well understood, and how do you then have that relationship which you can build on and then ensure that the flow of goodness goes both forwards and backwards into industry, but forward into the Army. So I think deprograms is a step forward in trying to achieve that.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Bill. I think, you know, there's that now or even before, that whole kind of industry theme and how industry plays into this, where the defence and security industry strategy sits, where it sits in with the IR. Clearly, quite a lot still to work through in terms of how best to approach that. But you know, at least I think, you know, the language is there in terms of how people are orientating on it and recognise the significance of it. I'm just, so the questions are coming flying in now, and I'm kind of going to tackle them in no particular order other than where I can see they group up a little bit. So I've got a question here from Cy Davis, who says, and this is really on the kind of the information theme, so AI, ML, digital twin, and other innovative programs are always evolving. They need to be introduced quickly, maintained and upgraded to maintain effectiveness. How is it proposed to do this within MOD processes, training and contracting support? And Bill, I think I'll come to you first, because I think this is probably where, of those in the panel, this kind of most affects you directly in the Army headquarters in terms of, you know, what are you pinning your hopes on, and how do you see that progressing as you take forward the IR?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. The ability to use a digital twin would be great. As part of the Agile stance work that Defence is leading on, in fact, CDLS's team with joint warfare, their ambition is to start to do that, and pretty quickly. So there's certainly work ongoing. You know, anything that's going to give you the ability to train, test, practice, deploy, all the elements that you need ahead of doing it for real. Why wouldn't you use a digital twin? I'm probably not close enough to it. I want it. I like it. How we're getting to it is not really within my bailiwick, sir. So I'm probably a bit of a duff answer, but there is certainly work ongoing.
No, that's fine. I don't know if Andrew or Daryl had any particular views on that.
I can come in there probably, Angus.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work going on in the area of AI, machine learning, and it's really good to see actually a whole host of projects now that are moving out in terms of AI, machine learning. In parallel, we have a draft defence AI strategy that's been written by head office at the moment that will come out in the autumn. And there's a lot of work going on around the ethics and sort of legal and moral aspects of this as well, as you might imagine. But it's just one example to bring it to life. Land at the moment within General John Cole's area are looking at a Land C2 Spearhead, which is AI based. It's an innovation project funded by the Defence Innovation Unit. Really exciting work that was recently used for the first time in operations in Cabrit, and fundamentally informed understanding and decision making and speeded up the estimate process. So there's some really interesting feedback coming out from just one project tonight. And of course, it has use in the operational space. It absolutely has use in the business space as well. Just in terms of how defence is taking it forward, probably at the heart of the defence strategy that's been written at the moment on the back of the IR and the DCP, so this is Defence Strategic Direction, sits a more data-centric integrated force and a digital backbone. And that's what General Patrick Sanders has got to deliver by Q3 24 on a NATO exercise called Integrated Defender. And that will display in practical terms a more integrated data-centric force with a cloud architecture, such that we can start to really exploit the use of information from close, or rather from open and closed sources, work on that information using AI from multiple sensors, or rather that information gathered from multiple sensors, work on it with AI to elicit insight that we've simply haven't had previously, whether that's in the supply and support area or whether it's in other parts of defence. So I think there's a lot going on. Defence Digital are responsible for the delivery of the digital backbone, and they're going to do the rapid iteration that Si spoke about, Angus, through something that General Tom Coppinger-Sims is developing with Charlie Forte, known as the Digital Foundry. So this will be essentially a virtual federated system, which is software focused, where it will take a sort of DevSecOps approach to the development of rapid software and applications that can be used to move capabilities on and rapidly iterate them. So there's a lot going on this space. So worth reading about the Digital Foundry and the Defence AI Centre, but a lot going on, and it's really quite exciting, actually. I think this will be, speeding up and ramping up over time.
And I guess if ever there was a subject for people of the RLC, soldiers of the RLC, to be really focusing on, going back to Bill's point about IT rather than CATSI, it's in this area where upskilling is going to take a lot of focus, and people need to make themselves pretty smart about it. I'm actually going to ask another question now rather than come to Andy. This one's from Gareth Allen, but it's directed, I guess to everybody, but he's commenting on Andrew's comment on lack of coherence of defence over what support means, strikes as valid. In NATO, support includes coordination of security, battle space management, stability activities, and response to hybrid threats. Logistics is one of various focus areas in support. And so the question is, to what degree do the speakers see diversity of the support concept as an opportunity versus a threat for professional logisticians? And Andy, I'll come to you first on that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just give you a little bit of time to think about that one. Yeah,
I think so. It's a really good point, and certainly one of the issues around accepting defence support was the recognition of what do we actually mean, and the defence support strategy does include a definition of defence support that has evolved over the last few years, but seems to be reasonably stable now. And as the functional owner for support within the defence operating model, it is within CDLS's gift to deliver that. Interestingly, then, how does that bump up against NATO and doctrine? Because as Gareth quite rightly points out, support within a NATO environment means something different. I guess my own view is that support and support transformation within UK defence is already bigger than Ben-Hur, and to broaden it further whilst potentially generating opportunities is only going to make it even more complex. And so I think this is one of the areas where it's probably reached its natural boundaries, and from a UK perspective, perhaps shouldn't go any further. But I do recognise that tramples all over the sort of primacy of doctrine and the NATO lead. So I think from a purely national selfish point of view, it's probably good where it is, but I understand that doesn't solve the NATO question. So it's probably only a half answer, sorry.
No, thank you, Andy. Bill, any views on that?
I think this is one of those we've been kicking around for a while, sir, isn't it? It's and you know, Gary's right to raise it. I mean, I suppose it's interesting, really, because alongside the Agile stance, strat-based work, there are other strands which look at things such as protection, strat-based resilience, which start to play into that wider sort of definition that Gary's raised there. So I think it's something that, you know, I'll probably echo with Andy in terms of capacity and scale. We're slightly out of kilter with NATO. You know, who do you pin it on? CDLS is trying to close with quite a lot at the moment. But actually what we might find is that as we progress with things like Agile stance, where we're starting to wrap this in, it's not seen as a separate activity. And also from an operational perspective as well, the concept of rear area security, which has long been sort of fobbed off as an SOP in the TAM. You know, understanding battle space management, as you and I have lived this dream in the past. There are no empty areas. That whole panoply of activity, it's can you do it with the resource you have?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, so many of these things are not new. The question is how you play them into a changed operating, a revised operating context with a slightly different perspective. I'm going to just flip to a people-related question, but there have been several people-related questions, so it's kind of double-barreled. So Kirsty Dunn has asked, from a people's perspective, do you think that the underlying competitive nature between our own forces, corps, and units that serve in group team characteristics might in any way undermine and be difficult to overcome in achieving, truly effective integration? And the kind of follow-up to that is, do we think more deployed, more forward, more used is counter to recruiting and retention in the long term? So, kind of two angles there. Andy, I'll come to you first, probably in the sort of the first aspect of that, and then maybe go to Bill and Daryl for both of them.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think Kirsty makes a very good point, and I'm afraid in this particular space, my glass is well and truly half empty. That there is an awful lot of evidence to point to the fact that the sort of tribal system of professions approach that serves the individual services very well will absolutely get in the way of achieving effective integration. It gets in the way of delivering the defence enterprise, i.e. everything that's not operations, every single day. And so I accept that's quite a negative approach, but there is a lot of evidence. We don't have time to dive into it right now, but it absolutely exists. The RAF moving Australia 200 miles to the north to win the carrier argument in the 1960s is a great example. That bad behaviour still goes on today, and in my mind will be one of the biggest issues in achieving effective integration. Rather than just being one of them, I think it'll be the most difficult to overcome.
Thanks, Andy. Daryl, views on that?
Yeah, thanks. So, I recognise absolutely some of the points there that Andy made. I think for me, it's about, and of course, there's some great strengths around tribal loyalties and strong cohesion, but of course, we all know that there are some weaknesses in terms of potentially a closed mindset to external perspectives, and that lack of sort of diversity and inclusivity that I genuinely think can improve our understanding and decision making, and it's really important. So for me, I think there's something here around incentives, and at the moment, to go back to a point that I think Bill made earlier on, I'm not convinced at the moment that the defence operating model, as envisaged by Levine, truly incentivizes the commands to operate and think, or rather to think and to really sort of develop capabilities and operate through that truly integrated approach. So there's something in the defence operating model around incentives that I think is quite important. And of course, there are reviews ongoing at the moment within Stratcom, within head office as well, that might help this. I think also, so that's at an organisation level, but we also need to get the incentives right at an individual level as well. And just one example of that, I am beginning to see change in the MS system, which is, I think, really welcome. So for the first time, really, in my military career, I just invited 8 or 9 subordinates of mine to conduct a multi-source assessment on sort of the way that I'm, leading the team at DCDC, which will inform my MPOP. That's got to be a really good thing. And it's, there are very clear objectives in there about getting the right culture right, bringing in different perspectives, work-life balance, etc. So I think Kirsty makes a good point. This is most definitely a work in progress. There are a whole range of threats out there that could scupper this, but I think there are some opportunities as well. I think in terms of recruiting and retention, again, there are some threats there, but I don't think many people join the army or the armed forces to sit on the Bergens for months and years on end. And I think, to be brutally honest, there's probably a generational perspective to the way one answers this question. But, in most of my sort of formative years, we were out and about an awful lot, and we really enjoyed it. And I think that's really exciting and actually can encourage recruiting and retention, because the force that's in use, having utility and being relevant in that sort of manner that we've described previously. But yes, we have to keep this in balance, which I think probably gets to Kirsty's point. And this is where, again, I think we can come up with novel approaches. We can have a global foundation with long-term footprints, with people appropriately supported, probably accompanied in these long-term appointments, which are supported by pulses, whether that's exercises, whether it's training, whether it's capacity building. And again, from a support perspective, if we think in a novel way about the way we're sustaining these operations, I think there's a real opportunity there to truly integrate with our industrial partners and deliver support in novel ways, dependent on the specific nature of the operation. And that can alleviate some of the pressure on military personnel, whilst encouraging the integration with industry, which I think is so important. So just a few reflections there, Angus.
Excellent. No, really good. Thank you for the insight, Darryl. You're a brave man being assessed by so many people at the same time. Bill.
Yeah, thanks. So I think General Darryl, unsurprisingly, has hit the nail on the head there in terms of the first thing I wrote down was Levine. There are so many pros and there are a number of cons associated with the tribal nature of our regiments, our trades, our services. It would be really interesting if we were to go into somewhere like the cyber domain or the space domain, where perhaps there's not that legacy or baggage, and perhaps it's a more joint arena to see how the dynamics play out there. And it's the same in the joint force intelligence community as well. If you go onto a joint course such as ACSC, the time you spend with the other services is absolutely first class in challenging your prejudices and ensuring that you really do understand what other people across the military do. And where that really reaps dividends is when you then go and work in a joint environment such as PJHQ or the MOD, and there's a real common sense of purpose. So I suppose I would absolutely recognise where some of those challenges are, and maybe there are areas where perhaps there's a comparison to be drawn. I think in terms of the point that Kirsty made about deployment and the impact on recruitment and retention, again, I agree with General Darryl on this. I think where people get frustrated is when they're either deployed at short notice, rather than the 180 days notice that we try and give them, inevitably because of a force generation fail, or they go to the same place time and time again. And it's how do you get the variety right, along with providing balance, work-life balance, it's an ongoing challenge, but similarly, you're faced with a frustration where people join the services and then don't deploy anywhere. So it's getting the balance right, and accepting that some people will join the army and will do an op-tour or will do a deployment and go, I've done it, thank you very much. I've scratched that itch and I'd like to leave now. So there are a number of different dynamics in there. I think we could probably be better, and we are trying to ensure that we're giving people the variety they need and taking into consideration domestic or personal considerations as well. So we're not trying to apply a blunt tool to individuals who perhaps do or do not want to deploy at a given time.
Yeah. Got it. Thank you, Bill. And I think probably our last question, given the time, I'm going to paraphrase a couple, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't just, in some sense, bring up the sustainability agenda in all this, because as General Darrell said, it was actually the #1 priority as articulated by the government in taking the IR forward. And so just to sort of bring some aspects together of that, Andy Curtis talked about increased demand on logistics. And we've also heard about how technology is going to save us from fossil fuels, and new batteries will reduce logistic demand. But of course, you know, there are real realities to, I don't know, a recapitalized Royal Air Force fleet, where we are quite a long way away from sustainable air fuel, certainly at, you know, at a cost-effective kind of level. The Army to date has recapitalized with Boxer and Ajax a significant amount of vehicles, which will be reliant on fossil fuels for, you know, quite some time to come. And even when we get to those new energy sources, whether that's deployed microgrids or in the case of, you know, CDS's aspiration for less reliance on fossil fuel, we still end up with the potential for new supply chains in terms of hydrogen or ammonia and the like. So how realistic is the aspiration that the sustainability agenda will reduce logistic demand relative to the activity level that really is, you know, the ambition that I've been hearing today? And, you know, Darrell, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Angus. So it's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I think we'd probably all recognise that it's a non-discretionary issue. I think that's the first thing. We have to think really seriously about the mitigation and the adaptability for a climate stress world. I think that's unequivocal. And I'm sort of, you know, we've supported General Nuge's work over the last 12 months in DCDC, and, you know, we're preparing Defence's approach into COP26, for instance, in November. So this has been taken quite seriously. But you're absolutely right in terms of, you know, there are a lot of questions around this at the moment in terms of the pace of change. Now, I think some of this will be driven increasingly by legislation, and we've seen legislation change over the last 12 months, not least no new sales of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. And I haven't seen the detail of today's transportation strategy, decarbonization strategy, which the government, I think, released today. So the truth is, we either get ahead of this in some way and embrace it, or we're going to be forced by legislation, because I don't think there'll be exemptions for defence in this area. I think, well, I don't think there will be, would be my view. I don't think there will be exemptions. So we've got to do something about this quite soon. I think we'll move out, first of all, with the lighter end of the market in terms of platforms. Clearly, it's more problematic at the moment when you're looking at big platforms, ships and aircraft, etc. And I think the way we have to view this is that we're on a transition. It's a transition that's probably going to take 10, 15, 20 years, possibly more. And you're right, Angus. The truth is the hardware is roughly fixed. We know roughly what we'll have by 2030, 2035. So the truth is the aperture probably opens up again in a sort of mid-2030 point when you start to think seriously about hardware. And I think this is what we will be doing in the next bit of work that we have to do, which is the future operating concept, which looks out to 35, 40, where we have a chance there, not just to look at the software, which is the focus for the next 5 to 10 years, but we also now look at joining that up with the hardware. So I think that's probably the opportunity. It's a transition. It's going to be a long-term endeavor. I think we'll need to we'll be led by industry. Industry will do all of the innovation in this, much of the experimentation. Industry will move ahead of defense. And I think we probably need a watch and, where appropriate, adopt approach to the way we do this. Because the regulations will just drive industry to really look hard at the technologies around this and make progress. So those would probably be, you're absolutely right. This is going to be a tricky issue, but it's going to be a long-term endeavor, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. And just in the interest of time, I'll probably just come to Andy Curtis for a couple of brief comments there.
So the only thing I would add to that is the opportunity for logisticians to have a voice at the front end of that process, because there is a real danger that we will end up with an increased burden on the supply chain because of the decisions that are made to the next generation of capability. One of the key inputs to that decision-making process has got to be the impact on the supply chain and therefore the impact on our sustainability. And I think it's beholden upon the next generation of logisticians to actually speak up early and try and influence that decision making. So not only do we end up with the capability that we want, but we end up with a viable supply chain that allows us to sustain that capability as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. And I'll draw it to a close there. I'm afraid we have just run over by a couple of minutes for the Q&A. So I'll keep my sort of closing comments short. First of all, thank you very much to our speakers. You have been fantastic, and I really appreciate the level of insight you've brought and really the kind of the breadth of thinking that you've thrown into the arena there. I apologize to our audience. There's some great questions I just have not been able to get anywhere near, but hopefully we've tackled some of the bigger issues there. I think CGS actually described it as a really big in-tray. So when you look at the scale of the threats, we spoke about those up front, the ambition for this global Britain and how it will apply itself and the military role in that. What I heard was, I don't know if everybody else heard it, I think I couldn't agree more. It is a great time to be a logistician, whether you're in uniform or whether you're part of industry that's in the defence sector playing into that piece. There's a huge amount to think about. It was quite clear to me that our people, whoever they are, clearly need to be thinking hard, and I know they are, about information technology and its application and how that's going to change our business. We definitely need to look at people upskilling. I know as a core that's always on our mind, but this context is really going to drive some things there. New ways of delivering effect where God forbid, breaking some sacred cows may be necessary because we're going to do this in a new context, at speed, at reach, and frankly, some of the ways we have done that business in the past simply won't apply. Although there are significant challenges, as you heard from Dr. Andrew Curtis, on some of the frankly institutional barriers, but also some of the practical barriers of we are where we are, and transformation takes time, as we just heard, when it comes to sustainability. So look, a fantastic seminar, really appreciated everybody's input there. Record audience again, so thank you to our attendees, and really look forward to taking the conversation forward. And good afternoon to you all.